Actually, we've covered a fair amount of topics. Many of you have heard Eckhart quote Descartes and other philosophers, religious and spiritual leaders. What many of you may not appreciate it, he likes movies. And one of the movies, which I know you've talked about, is Groundhog Day. There's actually some great enlightenment from that movie, and maybe you can...
Yeah. Well, if you haven't seen, you must see it, Groundhog Day. I've seen it maybe 6 or 7 times, and I'm sure I'll see it a few more times. Just to refresh your memory, if you have seen it, and then explain why I love it so much, what the very important message is. There's this man, the protagonist, the actor is Bill Murray. So his character is a weather forecaster. And so he is very, very negative. He dislikes most people. He dislikes his job. Wherever he goes, he complains and is unhappy. And that is his sense of identity. That is how he lives. So he travels to this place in Pennsylvania or somewhere. And
is it Punxsutawney?
Yes. And they have this ceremony. They release the groundhog on Groundhog Day to see if he goes back into his cage, because he is supposed to forecast how long the winter is going to last. So he's the weatherman, so he goes there with his team, a man and a woman, the cameraman and his assistant, just to film that. But he's just so unhappy and negative, dislikes this an awful place here. I want to get out of here as soon as I can. What a dreadful place to be, what a dump. And these are his thoughts, not the reality. They're his thoughts, but to him, that's his reality. And then, of course, he wakes up after they've done the filming. The next morning, they're supposed to go home. He wakes up, the bell rings, okay. And they can't get out of town because there's a snowstorm. They have to stay another night in this dump, this awful place. The next morning, he wakes up, and then a strange thing happens. The same thing happened to him the previous day. And then he begins to realize that he's reliving the last day. And he's get very weird. And then the film goes on. In other words, he is forced to relive this same day. He can never get out of town because of the snowstorm. Every morning he turns on, the alarm radio goes on and sings this song by Cher. I got you, babe. I got you, babe. And so it goes on, and we don't know how many times he has to relive that, hundreds of times. We don't see. After a while, he gets so desperate, he tries to commit suicide, and he does. But the next morning, he wakes up again in bed. So, and then at some point in the movie, his behavior changes. Instead of being nasty to people, he helps people. So he becomes a helpful force, and he goes around and makes people's lives better. I think he got so bored with suffering and disliking it. So and every day he begins to enjoy more, but every day he does new things to help the people. And of course, for those people, it's always just the first time it happens. And he begins actually to enjoy it. He cooperates with the present moment, as I put it. It's never explained in the movie, fortunately, because in good movies, the message is not explained. It has to be shown rather than explained. So the viewer can draw their own conclusions. And then the last scene is he wakes up and it's the next day. He can leave. But now he loves it so much, he says to his assistant, let's stay here. So he is released from the cycle of suffering as he begins to surrender and accept the present moment and becomes a positive force in the present moment. He is suddenly released from the cycle of suffering. And so that is the deeper message, that the way and so basically, I would say, everybody who is still totally identified with their conditioned mind lives his or her own Groundhog Day, because not exactly, but the conditioned mind tends to replicate itself. And if you're totally identified with the conditioning of your mind, which includes reactive patterns and so on, you tend to recreate similar life experiences through your reactions, and you tend to even to recreate similar relationships. Some of you might have noticed that tend to attract certain kinds of people. Why this seems very strange, but it happens. And that's because so basically everybody has his or her Groundhog Day in the head until they transcend it.
And it's wonderful you said that, ended that, because this is a metaphor for the power of compassion, if you will, because look what happened in his life. He was self-absorbed, everything was miserable, it wasn't good enough for him, and this is an inward placement of his worldview. It was only until he looked outward and embraced others and recognized their suffering and the power of intersecting with them and trying to relieve their suffering that he was finally released from his own suffering.
Yes.
And on that note, I think we'll end our dialogue, but we do have time for some questions, unless, of course, we've enlightened everyone and there are no more questions.
That's possible too, yeah.
Are there microphones on either side?